Hello, everybody. We are going to do our last new formula for right triangle trig. So let's start by doing a warm up to practice sine, and then we'll get into our next formula. So take a second to solve for y. Okay, so we have done tangent, we've done sine, and now we're going to do something called cosine. On your calculator, it's just the COS, so cos is all you're going to see. Okay, and it is going to use a similar formula. So now we're going to be using the adjacent over hypotenuse. So notice that tangent was opposite over adjacent, sine is opposite over hypotenuse, and now cosine is our last mixture, which is adjacent over hypotenuse. Okay, and so by this point, you should be getting, excuse me. Okay, so anyway, hopefully identifying the opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse is getting more and more simple for you. Remember, the hypotenuse is always directly across from the 90-degree angle, and it is always the largest side. Okay, so we are just going to go through and do some ratios. Same thing we set up with tangent and with sine is figuring out just how to identify our sides. So let me pull this up. Okay, so we are going to start, wrong way, just by looking at angle A. And if we look here at angle A, we have to identify the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. Okay, so the easiest one to identify is always the hypotenuse, right? We always know the hypotenuse is directly across from that 90-degree angle. So now we know that the adjacent has to be touching the angle. So the only one touching the angle is the side 8 there. So that has to be the adjacent. So we would say the cosine of A is equal to the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Okay? That's all you would have to do to be able to figure that part out. So for this next one, it's going to be the same. How would we figure out what our cosine would be? Well, especially when you only have two sides listed, you know one of them has to be the adjacent and one of them has to be the hypotenuse. So once you recognize that this one is the hypotenuse, you should automatically know that it is 7.3 over 8.1. You don't even have to identify an adjacent because it's the only other side that is there, right? So identifying the hypotenuse first is going to be the key to making sure you're setting this up correctly, okay? Another thing that kept coming up is some people were saying undefined or unable to solve. Please make sure that your calculator is in DEG mode, which is degree mode, since we're using degrees. If it is not in that mode, it's not going to understand what we're doing because it's going to be doing things in what's called a radian mode. So please make sure that you're in DEG mode, okay? So I'm going to have you guys practice with this one. We are looking for the cosine of angle B. All right, and you're just going to set up what the ratio is for adjacent over hypotenuse. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing we've done with tangent and sine. We are going to start using our formula, using cosine, to be able to set up and solve an equation. So we are still going to say, let me pull up this. We're still going to say that the cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse, right? So we know that the hypotenuse is C. So we can automatically put C at the bottom. We know that the adjacent is 8, and we know that the angle we're dealing with is 25, right? So let me write this a little clearer. Okay, and so like I was talking about in tangent or in sine, if your variable you're solving for is in the bottom, you have to flip-flop those two so that C is equal to 8 divided by the cosine of 25. Okay, that only happens when your variable is in the denominator. So now we're just going to plug that in, and you should get that C is equal to 8.8. Okay, and again, I highly recommend that you're plugging these things in with me to make sure you're getting the same answers as I am, so that you know that your calculator is working correctly. Okay, so for this next one, we're going to do the exact same thing. We are going to be looking for what A is equal to. So first thing we have to do is identify our hypotenuse. Okay, and in this case, our hypotenuse would be 30. So we would have the cosine of 22 equals, we know the 30 is on the bottom, it's the hypotenuse, and the side touching our angle is A. So in this case, we have to multiply both sides by 30, and we get A is equal to the cosine of 22 times by 30, 27.8. Okay? So when we're solving for the adjacent side, you're multiplying. When you're solving for the hypotenuse, you are dividing. So let's look at this again. Here's another example of what it might look like. Okay. Again, on this one, there's more information than you need, but we are only concerned with X. So we're going to set this up as the cosine of 40 equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is across from the 90 degree. We are going to flip-flop these two so that X is equal to 16 divided by the cosine of 40. And when we plug that into our calculator, we get X is equal to 20.9. I didn't write that very good. 20.9. Okay, 20.88, but that would round to 20.9. Okay, so anytime you're solving for the hypotenuse, that is how you're doing it. It was the exact same when we were solving this one right here for the hypotenuse. We are dividing to find that. Okay, so now we're going to do one more example to find our adjacent side, or to find the hypotenuse, because this isn't an example. This is a practice. So you get to practice this one. So this one is exactly the same as what we just did. So go ahead and set it up, solve for the hypotenuse. Okay, we're going to practice again, solving for the hypotenuse. Solving for the hypotenuse. I feel like this is the place where you're going to make the most errors. So practice this one again. Okay, so we've done a ratio, we've done a side length, and now we are going to do the angle measure, which the angle measure is the same. Find your ratio, use your inverse or the cosine -1 to be able to find it. So we are going to first of all set this up. Okay, we are looking here for angle A. We know that this is the hypotenuse. So we are going to take our inverse cosine of 5/10 because it's the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So when we do that, a lot of you guys, it's your second button and then the cosine button. When you do that, you get 60 degrees. Okay? So make sure you're setting it up correctly. Let's look at another one. Okay, using this exact same function, we have to figure out how we are setting it up. We are using our inverse cosine. We know the hypotenuse is 25. This side is touching it, so it's going to be 7/25. If I plug that into my calculator, 7/25, I get 70, about 74. I would just round to 74. Okay. Let's try one more together. Okay, one more together. So again, we have angle A is what we're looking for. So we're going to take this and we're going to have the adjacent over the hypotenuse. If I plug that in, I get 33.6 degrees. Okay. So I'm going to have you guys practice one more of these, and then we will be done with cosine. So hopefully you are finding that this is equally as simple. So go ahead and solve this. And after this, you do have a 4-question exit ticket. You need to score a 3 out of 4 on to get credit. So yeah, go ahead and solve for angle Y.